So thank you for joining us today. I'm going to share my screen as I just go through a brief introduction to the session. And here we are. There. So good morning and thank you for joining us in the Virtual Ocean Pavilion alongside, and this event is coordinated by the One Ocean Hub and the University of Plymouth, and it is recorded for future viewing. And if I could direct all of you to the chat and Q&A, ideally the Q&A if you have any questions for the speakers, and the chat if you have anything, an aside or comment you would like to make as we go along. We'll also be having a little brief pause after each speaker to answer some questions if you have them. So I'll give a brief introduction of the framing for the session here. So this morning our session will focus on ecosystem services and areas beyond national jurisdiction. And areas beyond national jurisdiction comprise the seabed, the water column, and the airspace above these areas, 200 nautical miles, outside of 200 nautical miles, and beyond the state's exclusive economic zones. So these are huge remote areas of our global ocean. And these areas of our ocean are critical for broad-scale ecosystem services that we all benefit from. So these are experienced as a healthy climate, food, spiritual and cultural well-being, among many others. So ecosystem services, you can see here on my schematic, and the consequent benefits arise from innumerable ecological relationships that operate at a range of spatial and temporal scales. And here I briefly presented a natural capital schematic to try and show the connections between the natural capital assets, so that's your sort of building blocks of species and habitats that all act together to deliver the ecosystem services and benefits. It also shows the different ways that the benefits are accrued by people, either diffusely as a healthy climate or directly, where often other human capital, such as investment in infrastructure or technology, is applied to extract the benefit. An example would be fishing in the areas beyond national jurisdiction. So human activity exerts pressure on this natural system at various points, often through activities, and there are concerns that these pressures are acting to degrade critical ecosystem services, such as the ocean's ability to regulate global climate. And so just briefly here, this is a little snippet into some of the work that I've been doing. I'm not giving a presentation, so I'll be very quick. So this, we know that these threats on the global ocean and the natural system exist, yet they're often excluded from consideration in marine natural resources management, often because the impacts or threats are often experienced diffusely, sometimes on a global scale. So the relationships that provide these ecosystem services are really not well known or very difficult to quantify. So this table from our work at the University of Plymouth as part of the One Ocean Hub shows how activities are exerting pressures or impacts on the benefits arriving from the ecosystem services of ABNJ. So red indicates that the pressure is ongoing or increasing, and there's a high risk of degradation. Amber indicates that that what's going on isn't known, and that there's no monitoring of these pressures, or there's only partial understanding. And so it paints a really stark picture of the need to improve the integration of ecosystem services into activities governance, and to consider how governance can or should respond to the threat of critical ecosystem services. So in recognition of the overarching influence of climate change on the global ocean through processes of warming, stratification, acidification, the lack of ecological knowledge of exactly which bits of the ocean system we need to protect to preserve critical ecosystem services, and a clear lack of consideration of ecosystem services in governance, we're holding this session to discuss this topic, to explore how climate change, biodiversity and ecosystem services are interrelated and are being considered within governance, and how we as a society can respond to that challenge. So we're lucky to have 4 speakers talking on a range of topics that touch on this area. We're starting now with Valentina Germani. So welcome, Valentina.
Thank you very much, Holly. And Just give me a second to share my screen. So hi everyone, it's a pleasure to be here with you, and thank you very much to the One Ocean Hub. That was not meant to happen. For inviting the Division for Ocean Affairs and Law of the Sea to this meeting on climate change and ecosystem services in areas beyond national jurisdiction. Also a big thank you to the COP27 Virtual Ocean Pavilion for hosting the event. In my presentation, I will provide an overview of the Intergovernmental Conference on Marine Biological Diversity of areas beyond national jurisdiction, and then briefly also focusing on the climate change references in that negotiation. But before we do that, I just wanted to go quickly over the reasons why we need to think about climate change in the context of marine biodiversity beyond national jurisdiction. And from now on, I'm just going to say BBNJ to save some time. And Holly already just explained to us the way these issues interlink. But just quickly to know that, to say that we know from scientific data and assessments, in particular the IPCC reports and the World Ocean Assessment, that the ocean plays a significant role in climate regulations as a carbon sink, possibly for carbon dioxide removal or CDR purposes, as well as in adaptation. At the same time, climate change is having devastating impacts on marine and coastal ecosystems, as well as coastal communities. So while the framework for mitigation and adaptation action is established under the UNFCCC and the Paris Agreement, the ocean is regulated by its own framework under the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, or UNCLOS. And the BBNJ agreement, which we will talk about in a little bit, is being negotiated under UNCLOS as an implementing agreement to UNCLOS. So let's just very quickly talk about what UNCLOS is for those who are not so familiar. It's obviously an international treaty. It has 168 parties, including the European Union. And this year marks the 40th anniversary of its adoption and opening for signature. UNCLOS is commonly referred to as the Constitution for the Ocean, as it provides really an overall framework for all activities in the oceans and seas, and for the protection and preservation of the marine environment. The preamble of the convention states that the problem of ocean space are closely interrelated and need to be considered as a whole under the convention. So climate change as a major problem faced today by the ocean, and also any ocean-based mitigation and adaptation action, are covered by the UNCLOS regime. So just a couple of key points. I don't need to go into the details, but I already mentioned UNCLOS sets out the legal framework within which all activities in the oceans and seas must be carried out. And this is recognized on a yearly basis by the UN General Assembly. It's complemented by a large number of regional and global sectoral instruments, including 2 implementing agreements to UNCLOS, and the one under negotiation, which is the one we'll focus on today. It establishes a number of institutions to facilitate its implementation, including the Tribunal for the Law of the Sea, the International Seabed Authority, and the Commission on the Limits of the Continental Shelf. But we also need to remember that all those other regional, global, sectoral instruments also have an institutional frameworks related to it. So the institutional puzzle is quite large, including for areas beyond national jurisdiction. And last but not least, the UN General Assembly also undertakes an annual review of the implementation of the convention and sets out general policies on ocean affairs and the law of the sea. But now let's turn to marine biodiversity of areas beyond national jurisdiction, or BBNJ, and in particular the negotiations under the conference. So what are areas beyond national jurisdiction? So under UNCLOS, ocean space is divided into various maritime zones, and beyond national jurisdiction, we have the high seas and the international seabed area, which is normally referred to as the area. Nearly 2/3 of the ocean, which cover 70% of our planet, as we know, are areas beyond national jurisdiction. And Holly, tell me if my math is correct, you're the scientist. I think that amounts to slightly under 50% of the surface of our planet as areas beyond national jurisdiction. So we're not talking about a small portion of the planet. So in areas beyond national jurisdiction, there's different legal regimes that apply. For the high seas, or the water column, we have the freedom of the high seas. It's not a complete freedom. There are some qualifications under the convention, of course. And then for the seabed beyond the outer limit of the continental shelves, we have the area, as I said, which is regulated by the common heritage of mankind. There's a number of sectoral organizations that have competence for these areas, and in particular for the activities that take place in the high seas. And then for the area, which capital A, there is the International Seabed Authority. But there is no overarching cross-sectoral coordinating mechanism for management. And this is why in 2017, the General Assembly convened an international conference to elaborate an international legally binding instruments on BBNJ to sort of deal with that gap of institutional and management coordination. So as many of you may be aware, the conference considers a package of issues. In general, of course, the conservation and sustainable use of biodiversity beyond national jurisdiction, and in particular, together and as a whole, marine genetic resources, including questions on the sharing of benefits, measures such as area-based management tools, including marine protected areas, environmental impact assessments, and last but not least, capacity building and the transfer of marine technology. And of course, in addition to those issues, a number of cross-cutting issues are also being considered. It's important to remember that the General Assembly, when establishing the conference, recognized that the work and results of the conference should be fully consistent with the provision of UNCLOS. It also recognized that the process and its results should not undermine existing relevant legal instruments and frameworks and relevant global, regional, and sectoral bodies. So those pre-existing bodies that I was telling you about a moment ago. And how to achieve this objective has been one of the most difficult aspects of the negotiations. We'll talk a little bit more about it in a second. But the IGC, or the Intergovernmental Conference, didn't come out of the blue. After 13 years of work, of preparatory work, in 2017, the GA established it. But as you can see from the slides, starting from 2004, the General Assembly and its subsidiary bodies have been addressing different aspects of the topics. In June 2004, the UN informal consultative process on oceans and North Sea discussed relevant issues. After that meeting, the General Assembly established an ad hoc working group to study issues related to BBNJ. 9 years of meetings of that working group passed, and in 2015, the GA decided to develop an international legally binding instrument under UNCLOS, and decided to establish a preparatory committee, which met for a couple of years until July 2017, when the PrepCom adopted its report and recommendations to the GA. On the basis of those recommendations, then, as I said, in 2017, the GA, the General Assembly, decided to convene the Intergovernmental Conference, which, as we said, is still going on. And it had its last meeting earlier this year in August 2022, the 5th IGC met, and it was hoped that the negotiations would be finished at the 5th IGCs. Delegations got very close, but not all the way to the end. So there will be a resumed IGC 5 early next year. So delegations are still discussing the 4 issues that I already mentioned to you a moment ago, including the cross-cutting issues. And just to recall that during the IGC 5, the last one in August, really delegations attempted as much as it was humanly possible, I think, to bridge the remaining gaps in the text. And the President, Ambassador Rina Lee from Singapore, had prepared a revised text for the 5th meeting. And during the meeting itself, she prepared 2 further revised or refreshed text. But as I said, delegations ran out of time and agreed that more time was necessary to finalize the agreement. So one of the issues that still remains to be resolved, as I already mentioned, is the relationship between the BBNJ instrument and other instruments, frameworks, and bodies. And in particular, it's worthy to again remember that the General Assembly stated that the new instrument should not undermine those existing instruments and bodies. And delegations take very different views of what that means, with some preferring to have an approach where the regional sectoral approach remains the priority, with the global instrument as providing guidance and recommendations. And then on the other spectrum of those positions, there are those delegations that really favor a global approach with a strong legally binding instruments, with which also would have a mandate for adopting management measures itself. So now, how is climate change featuring in all of these? I have copied and pasted here on this slide what the current text of the agreement contains in relation to climate change. So you will see there in the preamble, there's a recognition to the need to address in a coherent and cooperative manner biodiversity loss and degradation of ecosystems of the oceans due to, in particular, climate change, pollution, and overuse. In Article 1, which is the article on the use of terms, paragraph 8 recognizes that within the definition of cumulative impacts, climate change and ocean acidifications are amongst those impacts. And I want to mention that there are currently 2 versions of this article in the text. But both of those options include the reference to climate change and ocean acidification. So we could imagine that that will remain whichever version will be chosen by delegation in the end. Under Article 5 on general principles and approaches, one of the approaches that is listed is one that builds ecosystem resilience to the adverse effect of climate change and ocean acidification, and restores ecosystem integrity. Again, this is one of those articles that it's still under negotiation, so we'll have to see what happens. And then finally, under Article 14, which is in the part of the agreement dealing with area-based management tools, including marine protected areas, in the objectives article under that part, we see there is a subparagraph C, which refers to rehabilitate and restore biodiversity and ecosystems, including with a view to enhancing their productivity and health, and building resilience to stressors, including those related to climate change, ocean acidification, and marine pollution. And then in Annex 1, which is still related to BMTs and MPAs and the criteria for identification of areas, there is a mention as one of the criteria to vulnerability, including to climate change and ocean acidification. So as you see, there's a few references to climate change. What that will mean in practice will have to be further seen and elaborated once the agreement, of course, is finalized and then eventually comes into force. And on these articles, please do keep in mind that the negotiations are still ongoing, so it's not a given that they will all be reflected in the text as I have shown them here. So what's coming next? The dates of the resume IGC 5 should become available in early December, so only in a couple of weeks, once the General Assembly has adopted its resolution on oceans and the law of the sea. And at that point, the information will be posted by the division on the conference website. But just a sneak preview here, it is quite likely that the conference will be resumed at the end of February, beginning of March 2023. So the saga continues. And with that, I want to thank you for listening to me. And of course, I'm here if anyone has any questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Valentina. That's lovely. Lots to take in, and I guess it's a bit of a moving feast at the moment. I don't know if anyone has got any questions for Valentina at this moment. If you could pop them in the Q&A. Thanks, Sonia. It's just prompting you there in the chat. But if we don't, at this point, I don't know if any of the panelists have anything. You can raise your hands if you'd like to ask one. But perhaps we can come back to that at the end and move on to our next speaker now. So feel free to leave your questions and we'll keep an eye on the Q&A as we move into the next speaker. I know it can take a little bit of time to sort of process what you've just heard. So now we'll move on to Aurélie Spadone from IUCN. So I'll just hand over to you, Aurélie.
Thank you very much. I hope you can see my slides and hear me well. So thank you very much for inviting me, and I want to thank the One Ocean Hub and Holly Niner from the University of Plymouth for giving me the opportunity to share our work in this COP27 Ocean Virtual Pavilion. So I'm going to talk to you about tiny organisms, or they can be very tiny, but have huge importance for all life on Earth. And this is marine plankton. So plankton planktons are marine drifters, which mean like they are organisms that are carried along by tides and currents, and they are absolutely everywhere on the globe, from invisible bacteria and viruses to krill and enormous and wonderful jellyfish. So they have a huge importance because they provide incredible ecosystem services. So the first thing is they are the basis of the whole marine food web. And this is very, very simplified way of showing that, yeah, you have the phytoplankton, which is basically doing the photosynthesis function, and they are eaten by the zooplankton, and then they are eaten by fish and larger animals. So we can really say that plankton provide the initial energy supply for all components of the ocean ecosystem. The second thing that plankton is providing to us is like they uptake carbon dioxide and they produce oxygen. So they really help to regulate Earth's climate. And in the past 5 decades, the ocean has absorbed 23% of anthropogenic carbon dioxide emission. So we can really figure out that it's really providing a huge ecosystem services to all life on Earth. So incredibly important to the ocean ecosystem. And a large part of this is taking place in areas beyond national jurisdiction, because they represent 64% of the ocean surface, as we know. I'm going to talk to you here about what climate change has an impact on the ocean, and we believe in IUCN that we should have like a multi-stressors approach to understand all the impacts that climate change have on the ocean. And we know that there is this warming, it's warming the ocean, it's making it more acidic because of all the CO2 that is uptake. There's also deoxygenation due to climate change for the ocean. And one of the effects that we can see is that the occurrence of very strong marine heat waves events like we had in the Mediterranean Sea this summer. I mean, and we can all this should be taken cumulatively and with interaction between them. I mean, and it's so we can really figure out the amount of impact that climate change is having in our ocean. So I'm just talking about the marine heat waves there, and so that they really increase the frequency and intensity more recently. And we also have been working in IUCN on the deoxygenation effects on all the ocean ecosystems. So that is happening. So what are the impacts of climate change on our marine plankton? So marine plankton, they are very sensitive to changes in their environment, including the temperature, the salinity, the pH level, and the nutrient concentration of the water. So researchers are studying how climate change affects plankton, and their first initial findings is that you have a poleward migration of certain species that are from temperate latitude and are going to polewards, or from tropic to temperate latitude. There is a change in the composition of the plankton population everywhere on the globe, and what they call the tropicalization of temperate regions, which means you have like species of plankton that usually are in the tropics that migrate to the temperate regions. And all these changes in the plankton population have direct consequences for the fish population, for example, that like will follow them. And in the tropics, and that's a big question, because we can see the emergence of novel conditions that we haven't seen yet on this planet. And we don't know what combination of species will be there in the future. So that's really one of the points that needs to be further explored and understood by scientists. What we need to understand, and it's a very important point, is that all these impacts are touching the function provided, what I just mentioned at the beginning of my set, which means there is a global decrease of productivity and less export of organic carbon to the deep ocean, because if you change the plankton population, you also change all these functions that they are providing. And one thing that is not well understood is the link between the biodiversity and these functions, and that are already under fast changes, which means we are probably losing species and losing some relationship between species that we, even before we discovered them. We noticed that there is a lack of integration of the marine plankton diversity into international policy framework. And like for now, the global assessment by the IPCC and IPBES didn't, until now, take into account marine plankton diversity metrics. And why that? I think we identified that there's a lack of information on how this marine plankton species evolves, and what are the drivers and the patterns on their repartition on the globe. So IUCN and ETH Zurich, the Polytechnical School of Zurich, decided to collaborate, and we built a project that is called MapMaker, and that was funded and made possible by the Geneva Science Policy Interface back in 2020 and 21. So MapMaker stands for Marine Plankton Diversity Bioindicator Scenarios for Policymakers. So what we really aim to do, and we did, is like build an interactive tool for policymakers by researchers. It was really to work on at this science to policy interface, and like build the bridge between what science is doing or struggling with and what policy makers needs to know. And so the tool that I will show you just after is like really to visualize marine plankton diversity changes through different metrics, biodiversity index, along 3 scenarios of future atmospheric greenhouse gases concentration, which are the RCPs from the IPCC. So 2.6, 4.5, and 8.5. And really the idea is that the policymakers can play and look at the projection until the year 2100, and to the end of the century, and see what it mean for plankton diversity. So this is an online, freely accessible visualization tool. It has been redesigned recently by Epsilon. So Epsilon core purpose is to advance technology to preserve and improve life on Earth. And they have a data for good initiative, and they're also trying to tackle the challenges from climate change. So they provided to us to redesign the tool to make it look better, faster, and to be able to circulate and diffuse it to the policymaker group. So I'm gonna stop this presentation and share my other screen immediately, and this is it. So hopefully you can see the tool now. So so you have very quickly, you have a couple of functions here. You can move your mouse over the different box and get some explanation of what we're going to see. So we can maybe select the species richness here. We will look at the phytoplankton. We will try to see the difference between the business as usual scenario versus the following the Paris Agreement scenario. And then I click on run calculation, and it's coming, and you will be able to see the differences very soon. So this is how it looks. So you have the representation on the globe, where you can turn around, and you have a map where you can look very more in details into your value. And we can move the slide bar here. Here we are in the year 2012, and let's move towards the year 2093, for example. And you can see that the percentage of species, so the species richness difference between the two RCP scenarios will reach 15 degrees in all these red areas. And so what does that mean? I mean, it's like we can see that it will represent an increase in diversity, and this mean a diminution of the average cell size, so which we will have smaller organisms, and in average the productivity will decrease, and then the ecosystem, so both the CO2 uptake and the food available for higher trophic level will decrease as well. I mean, so that's like a way to be able to see what happened, and the policymakers can also zoom, for example, to this region and click, for example, here, so you to get time series that you will be able to see below, and it's coming. Yeah, so this is very quickly what the tool can do. And I will go back to my slides. Okay. And so so you can see the potential of these tools, and that really the idea is to increase the link between the policy, the science and the policy, and get a better understanding and a better integration of this diversity of plankton future changes into the policy framework, and including the BBNG, of course, for the areas beyond national jurisdiction. So in a conclusion, what I said, so marine plankton will is providing immense and vital ecosystem services, and they are not taken into account into those frameworks. So the linkages between from science to policy will be strengthened, streamlined, and make faster, easier for everyone. And policymakers should have access to the tool that help them visualize the change as a function of choice, that as I showed to you, and playing with different indices of diversity. And more funding in science to better document the link between the changes in diversity and the ecosystem function and associated services. And here I'm thinking also about fisheries, because if you have the change in the marine plankton communities, and how it goes from the phytoplankton to the zooplankton to the fish, I mean, will change, and you can have you can see an impact on fisheries, and probably it will mean that if the size of the fish, for example, diminish, you will have to fish more, and you will have to fish further away from the coast, so we can see the pressure also increasing in areas beyond national jurisdiction. And finally, I want to mention here the marine genetic resources aspect. That is one of the parts that Valentina presented to you, and part of the BBNG agreement, from a marine plankton organism. I mean, we need to preserve them and not destroy them before even discover them and be able to use them, because they could be like bacteria that allow an enzyme that will help to advance the technologies to, for example, depollute, or that will give access to new medication and cosmetics and etc. So that's also this whole aspect of marine plankton organisms that need to be considered as well. So I've put a slide here, and I will be happy to respond more questions and share those links about our work. And yes, I would like to thank you again, and I'm happy to respond to any further question. Thank you for your attention.
Lovely, thank you, Aurélie. It's fascinating. There is a question for you. I mean, there's several people requesting a link to the tool, but I guess you can do that a bit later on. There's a question from Darren Roeder. Apologies if I've pronounced your name incorrectly. In terms of plankton, besides preserving them, should we be promoting ways to positively encourage their growth in proactive ways?
Yeah, so I think absolutely. I think we should try to, I mean, better understand would be my first answer. I mean, we need to better understand exactly how the communities work, how it is links between the diversity and the function they provide. That's what one of the points I mentioned in the end. And proactively growing them, I guess we're taking onto the carbon dioxide removal question, and I think that's a complex question. So I'm not sure I want to enter into this discussion here, but definitely promoting recognizing the importance of what plankton is doing for us on this planet as a key element of all marine life. I mean, yeah, is needed.
Great. So there are lots of people requesting the tool. Oh, there's a question. Valentina will come back to that at the end. So if I could now move on to the next speaker. Thank you, Aurélie. And we'll hand over to Alana Lancaster. We'll be touching on how human rights might link into this topic. Alana? Lee.
Hello, everyone. Good, whatever time it is of the day. Okay, thank you. So hello, everyone. I'm going to look at the human rights aspect of oceans through the lens of areas beyond national jurisdiction in the context of climate change. Now, the human rights and the ocean climate nexus are essentially human rights in the context of the ocean or marine spaces are either absent or underdeveloped as compared to the terrestrial aspects. And they are not explicitly catered for in many of our sustainability development goals. And this absence is reflected in the ocean climate nexus in terms of the law and policy. However, we at the One Ocean Hub have been doing a significant amount of work in relation to the inclusion of these human rights in the with respect to the ocean. And we have identified inextricable links between human rights, including children's rights in marine spaces. And you'd remember Valentina would have illustrated the different territorial or spaces under the 1982 Law of the Sea Convention. So the exclusive economic zone, which is very important to many states, and then you have the area and areas beyond national jurisdiction, which includes the area. But as Valentina would have explained, the areas under the jurisdiction of the International Seabed Authority, whereas the water column is not under such a specific body. Now, in addition to the zonation, there are also human rights that accrue to many key users or uses of the ocean, such as small-scale fisheries, and as well as ocean, climate, and environmental defenders. And when we bear in mind that in many countries, especially developing countries, ocean spaces, these are largely coastal areas, and these ocean spaces are very critical to the economy, especially the economy of a large percentage of the population. The including human rights is very important. And it's also important because climate change can impact on, sorry, my slides are, climate change can impact on many of, or the sanctity of many of these rights. Happily, we have seen at COP26, the ocean being integrated into all areas of the climate, the Framework Convention for Climate Change in the Glasgow Declaration. We have seen recent mention of the ocean in the latest report by the Special Rapporteur on Human Rights in the context of climate change, and a report to which the One Ocean Hub would have made some contributions. In addition, we see many human rights bodies are addressing or viewing the issue or reflecting and pronouncing on the issue of human rights with respect to the ocean and climate change. And two very important decisions are that of the Human Rights Committee in 2020 in Titola and New Zealand. And this is in relation to climate migration and the refugee issue. And in September of this year, the body, in another landmark decision, found that climate inaction on the part of Australia, in fact, violated rights to culture and family. In addition, in 2016, the Inter-American Court on Human Rights pronounced an advisory opinion, which, while it related to the transboundary harm in regard of a regional seas agreement for the Caribbean, for the wider Caribbean region, Cartagena Convention, has implications for the climate ocean nexus. I wouldn't go into this, suffice it to say this is another representation of how extensive areas beyond national jurisdiction are. Many of these points Valentino would have spoken to, as well as Aurelie, in terms of the richness of biodiversity, but also the sheer expanse of areas beyond national jurisdiction. And these are the areas in dark blue. Now, the degradation, for example, of biodiversity is a factor that impacts the ocean's resilience and consequently will have a corresponding impact on the humans and other ecosystems. Again, broadly speaking, and Aurelie touched on this, there are four main impacts of climate change on the oceans, and these are driven largely by a broad diversity of activities and will in turn impact activities. So it's a kind of catalytic cyclical effect. So these are ocean warming, acidification, deoxygenation, and as Aurelie mentioned, heat waves. Now, what these effects have three main impacts that I'd like to focus on today, and that's loss of biodiversity. And it is worth mentioning that essentially, as Aurelie said, so much of our biodiversity in areas beyond national jurisdiction are unknown, and we may be losing these species before we can even begin to understand their role to basic chemical ecosystem and other processes. Threats to food and nutrition security, again, a very important area, because fisheries and seafood provide a significant amount of protein and nutrition, including macronutrients, omega fatty acids, and so on. And this is especially significant to developing countries, including several small island developing states, which would be not only impacted in terms of food and nutrition, but also livelihood, because a significant percentage of their population depend either directly or indirectly on the marine boat in the exclusive economic zone and areas beyond national jurisdiction for their livelihoods. So how can we view human rights in areas beyond national jurisdiction? It is worth noting that many of these rights exist in the ocean, and what I sought to do here is contextualize them within the context of the existing or the draft that we have of the international legally binding instrument, as it's called, to date, which is the August 2022 draft. So the overarching, so we have these rights are divided, into substantive rights and procedural rights. So first, I will examine the substantive rights. Now, the first is the overarching right to a healthy environment, and this right was strengthened in July of 2022 by the UN General Assembly Resolution 76-300, and we find references in the preambular paragraph 3, as well as Article 6 of the International Legally Binding Instrument. And the importance of this right is especially for the poorest and most vulnerable in our population, including children. And I'm not going to go through each of the necessarily go through, but you have them there. I'll identify the groups. So we have children, women, persons with disabilities, and we have indigenous and Afro-descendant people. And these are important because these are often the first and hardest hit by the impacts. Next, we have the right to health, and you know, there are very many climate change impacts on the ocean's ability to address many issues that relate to health, and also one of the synergies that we can identify between the climate change regime and is that of the climate change regime and the regime immersion on ocean plastics. There will be a meeting in regard to deliberating on a much like this process, international treaty for regulating ocean plastics. And there will be synergies between health and the climate change regime and the human rights to the ocean. And these deliberations will take place, I begin in 2 weeks. Water, this is related to in the preamble paragraph in terms of ecosystem services, and this is very important of the role of the ocean in the water cycle. We have food and nutrition, and as I would have mentioned before, the importance of living marine resources, especially fisheries and seafood. And I just want to highlight that, for example, water surrounding some small island developing states, and these are both their exclusive economic zone as well as areas beyond national jurisdiction support, for example, the largest tuna fishery of any ocean. And these are small island development states in the Pacific. So that goes to not only food and nutrition security, but also economic security. Other rights worth noting are labor rights, culture and heritage. This would have been mentioned in the Torres Straits Island case. So a reference I find to it is Article 5B, but this is currently bracketed. So we are unsure whether this will make it into the final agreement, but at least it is contemplated and under discussion. The right to science, and critical to one of the underpinning elements of the final agreement will be ultimately the ocean science that links not only to climate science, but biodiversity and other areas. Also important in terms of rights is the fair and equitable sharing of resources, because most of the resources, so in terms of the areas beyond national jurisdiction, as Valentina would have mentioned, the column of the sea is what we call mare liberum with some limitations. And this means that developing as well as landlocked and other disadvantaged states can be at a disadvantage, and consequently their people. We have the right to education, which is mentioned or we can glean from some of the articles. In terms of the procedural rights, we have access to information, and this is largely covered in the EIA process. There are articles on participation in decision making. In access to information, this is mainly through the EIA and STA procedure, as well as the provision for transboundary EIAs. Access to justice, this will heavily rely on the adoption and tenets of human rights-based and ecosystems approach, as well as interacting with other instruments, including the broader Law of the Sea Convention framework and other main international agreements, such as the Climate Change Convention and the Convention on Biological Diversity. And as Valentina pointed out, while the current convention acknowledges that there will be interaction and nothing should prejudice the existing relationship, we will need to see what the final relationship will be once we have a final text. Finally, ocean climate change and environmental defenders. I've identified some potential entry points, some of which are currently bracketed. And I also asked the question whether preambular paragraph 6 imposes an obligation on the state to act as a steward, or it says the state should act as a steward. What is the extent of this obligation for states? So in conclusion, we get a sense that in August that we are nearing the conclusion of an agreement. The current draft is a lot more coherent than the previous draft. However, the proof will be in the pudding, the implementation of the agreement, or I think it will befall many of the pitfalls and quagmires we see with the current climate change framework. And given the importance of the ocean climate nexus, there's a critical entry point with developing and looking at how human rights could be considered in areas beyond national jurisdiction, both substantively and procedurally, which will this will fully crystallize or largely crystallize when the agreement is finalized. However, while the agreement is nearing its completion, this is the process that we need to begin thinking of now, so that there's not a lag between when the agreement comes into force and when we begin these approaches. Because again, we really, the importance of these areas, not only to biodiversity and general processes, but also to mitigating the impacts of climate change, is critical. Thank you. I hope I did not go too quickly, but I'm open for any questions.
Thanks, Alana. Thanks so much. Apologies for chaos here. I've just been evacuated from my office as a fire alarm, so I missed most of your presentation, Alana. But I can't see if there are any questions for you at the moment. Perhaps there will be.
I hope you're okay, though.
Oh, fine.
Okay.
But I will just pass on to the next speaker. So if you could just pop your questions, if anyone has any questions for Alana in the Q&A, that would be great. And I'll just pass on to Sebastian and Christina now, and I'll turn off my microphone. Thank you.
That's wonderful. Thank you very much. So yes, so the talk will be given, or the little presentation will be given by two of us today. So I will start off, and then I'll hand over to my colleague Christina Beck about halfway through to really think more about a future look of where we're going. So we've heard quite a lot of context already today, and I'd like to actually dive into one of the ecosystems which is going to be under threat from climate change in areas beyond national jurisdiction now. So just to start with, I've just got this picture of a cold water deep sea coral reef. And this was taken from inside a submersible a few hundred meters down. And I think this is one of the challenges that we're faced with. So these are really important, but very hard to access deep sea ecosystems. And quite often, all we get are little snapshots, such as this little picture here, or a few samples which we're able to collect. And this is one of the greatest challenges as we're scaling up to some really quite large areas to cover. So we'll today be covering the future of cold water coral reefs and their biodiversity, what we know and what we don't know in the short and also the longer term as well. So you've all heard of tropical coral reefs, and you may have heard them referred to as rainforests of the sea, and exactly the same is true for cold water coral reefs. They're made of hundreds of different species, and they have quite a large distribution across the deep ocean floor. And of course, many of these are within national jurisdictions, but as we go into areas beyond national jurisdiction, these are quite often associated with seamounts or ridges or other areas where there's quite a lot of biodiversity, so hotspots of biodiversity. So these ecosystems are very important as we go into ABNJ. Now, with these corals, they create these hard calcium carbonate skeletons, and you can see top right, you can see this white skeleton underneath the translucent living tissue. And importantly, these skeletons persist, they stay there once the organism itself is dead as well. And so these ecosystems are really, really complicated frameworks of these interlocking skeletons, and they create lots of homes for all different types of biodiversity. And there are a few key species which can do these, and the coral which I'll be speaking mostly about today is Lophelia pertusa, but there are a handful of others which create these large-scale ecosystems which support high amounts of biodiversity. So we know that these cold water coral reefs support high amounts of biodiversity, and you can see the picture at the top right here. You can see the live coral, which is the white coral, and you can see a lot of this grey dead coral as well. And it's this dead coral which we've really discovered is as important, if not more so, in supporting these high amounts of biodiversity. And so we have a little schematic here, and what we do know is that as you move away from these cold water coral reefs, you get less and less biodiversity. So these cold water coral reefs and the complex frameworks which they create support high amounts of biodiversity. Now, of course, there's been a lot of focus on the live animals in the past, but it's only recently that we've really started to understand how important it is to really focus on the dead material as well, especially when we look forward into the quality of these habitats in the future. And so apart from all the different fish and crustaceans and mollusks that these reefs support, we also know that shark and rays will routinely use these complex frameworks to deposit their egg cases. So they're very important to a whole range of different species. So when we look to the future, we need to understand not only will the live coral survive it, but also what will happen to the habitat as a whole, and in particular the dead coral skeleton. And this will very much shape the types and amounts of biodiversity that it will be able to support going forward. So we've already heard about some threats to marine ecosystems in general today, and for cold water corals, it's no different. There's ocean warming, deoxygenation, ocean acidification, and we'll be speaking more about ocean acidification in the next few slides. But reduced food availability as well. So it's wonderful to see the MapMaker app earlier, and really as a tool to see how the future food supply may change. And this is why we're very interested in this from the corals' point of view, because these corals are capturing passing prey as they go by. So less food will mean they are less able to tolerate or cope with future environmental change. And of course, there are other direct impacts such as trawling and sedimentation from trawling as well, which can lead to degradation of habitats. And these will not only impact where the live coral can live and thrive and grow, but also the quality of the habitat as a whole. So will we lose some of the dead coral skeleton? Will we lose the framework as a whole? And what does this mean to biodiversity support? So I'll focus a little bit more on ocean acidification. And of course, this is all created by increasing amounts of carbon dioxide, which we're releasing into the atmosphere, dissolves into the ocean, and it reduces their pH, and it makes it more acidic than they are now. And this is where the term ocean acidification comes from. Not that the oceans will be acidic to the touch, but that they're becoming more acidic than they are now. So there's a very important depth, especially with regards to coral in the ocean. It's called the aragonite saturation horizon. And aragonite is the type of calcium carbonate that corals build their skeletons out of. Now, there's a natural depth in the ocean, and this aragonite saturation horizon. Above this depth, exposed coral skeleton will not dissolve. If you go below the depth, then coral skeleton will start to dissolve as aragonite becomes undersaturated, and the coral skeletons will start to increase in porosity and dissolve. But the problem with climate change is that this aragonite saturation horizon is becoming shallower and shallower and shallower. So it may be a few thousand meters at the moment, but this is going to be a few hundred meters projected by the end of the century. Now, at the moment, 95% or around 95% of cold water coral reefs are sitting above this aragonite saturation horizon, so we're not at risk of dissolution of the dead coral skeletons. But by the end of the century, the majority of these cold water coral reefs will be below the aragonite saturation horizon, so about 70% below and only around 30% sitting above this saturation horizon. So the majority of cold water coral reefs could be subject to potential dissolution of this dead coral skeleton, which, as we've already covered, is really important for the biodiversity that it can support. So this is just a little schematic about what may happen. For those of you that are interested in the chemistry, there's a little chemistry bar on the left, but the main parts I'd like to talk about are the part in the middle and also on the right. So here in the middle, we have a slice of a coral reef, and going through this slice of coral reef, there is a dotted line or a dashed grid box, and this is the aragonite saturation horizon. So above this, we have coral reefs, which have a good amount of live and dead coral skeleton and hosting all different types of biodiversity. But as we go down to the aragonite saturation horizon and below it, we're starting to get dissolution of the coral skeleton. These complex reefs are becoming simpler and they're starting to crumble. So we're having a simplification of these reefs, and this will have implications for the amounts and types of biodiversity that they will support. So now I'm going to hand over to my colleague, Christina, who will take us more upon a future look into what we will know in the short term, but also in the long term as well.
Thank you very much. So yeah, as you've heard, cold-water coral reefs will be affected by changes of multiple environmental factors in the future due to climate change. So it is very important that we get a better understanding what these cold-water coral reefs will look like in the future and how their biodiversity will be affected. So we can do this by studying cold-water coral reefs that already experience extreme conditions such as aragonite undersaturation. And here we can, for example, look at the skeletal structure of the corals from these extreme sites and compare them with coral that have not been exposed to extreme conditions yet. Another possibility is that we conduct aquarium experiments with live and dead corals under multiple stresses. And the results of both of these approaches can then be used to model the future of cold-water coral reefs. So these two pictures give you an idea what cold-water coral reefs can look like under different environmental conditions. On the left, you see a reef that is located above the aragonite saturation horizon, and you see a complex three-dimensional framework here. You see some live corals, but also lots of dead coral framework, which provides habitat for other species of fish and invertebrates, and it's therefore very important as a whole ecosystem. Whereas on the right side, on the other hand, we see coral that are located below the aragonite saturation horizon, and here only small colonies of live coral are visible, and we don't see any dead coral skeletons. So you can clearly see that cold-water corals below the aragonite saturation horizon provide less habitat for other organisms. So if we have a closer look at the skeleton of live and dead coral that were collected below the aragonite saturation horizon, you can clearly see why we find this difference. So on the left side, you see a skeleton of a live coral, which was completely covered by tissue. This means that the skeleton was not in direct contact with seawater and was therefore protected from the acidic conditions. And therefore, we don't see any dissolution here. Whereas on the right side, you see a dead skeleton without any tissue, and therefore the skeleton was directly exposed to the seawater, which was undersaturated with respect to aragonite, and therefore we see clear signs of dissolution here. You see the same effect on this video, where you only see porosity in the dead skeleton on the right side, because it was not covered with tissue. So on the outside of the skeleton, you see many small holes, which you can't see on the live skeleton because this again was protected by the tissue and did not dissolve. So another possibility to study the effect of future environmental changes on cold-water corals are lab experiments. And it's very important that we here focus on the effect of multiple stresses. As you've heard, corals will be affected by a combination of different stresses in the future. So we're planning to conduct an experiment where we look at the combined effect of reduced oxygen concentration, reduced pH, elevated temperature, and reduced food availability. And we'll study the effect of the combination of all of these four factors on the growth rate of live corals and also on the dissolution rate of the dead coral skeletons, to get a better idea how the cold-water coral reefs will look like in the future. We plan to run the experiment over 1 year, and this will give us a better idea of the timescales over which these changes will occur. And then in the end, we can use these results to model the structural integrity of reefs, and the results can also be used to determine when and under which condition the habitat of cold-water coral reefs may be lost, and so also the biodiversity they are associated with. So it is well known that cold-water coral reefs are threatened by climate change, and we know that the ongoing environmental changes will have an effect on the growth of cold-water corals, and will also determine where cold water coral reefs will thrive in the future. And as the cold water coral reefs will change from a complex three-dimensional habitat to a much simpler and less complex structure, this will certainly decrease the quality of the habitat and also reduce the amount of biodiversity that is associated with them. However, we don't know yet when the cold water coral reefs will change and over which timescales, and we don't know yet when and how much the biodiversity of these ecosystems will be affected. And in addition, we don't know yet where all the cold water coral reefs are located, so especially in the areas beyond national jurisdiction, because we're still discovering new cold water coral reefs, and there's clearly more research needed, especially in the ABNJ regions. So ocean acidification will affect about 70% of cold water corals until the end of the century, and they will be exposed to conditions that will lead to habitat loss. And lab experiments can give us more insights into the timescales over which these changes will occur, and the results can then be combined with climate projections to give us a better idea of the risk and timescales of habitat and biodiversity loss in cold water coral reefs. And this will then also increase our understanding of the effect on ecosystem services and the biodiversity in these reefs, and give us a better understanding how this will also affect higher trophic levels that are also dependent on the reefs. Thank you very much for listening. And we're happy to take any questions.
Lovely. Thank you, Christina. Thank you, Sebastian. Thank you so much. I've now moved outside, so hopefully I have a nice herring gull sitting next to me, so hopefully he won't get too much in the way. I'll mute myself if he does. So I don't know if any of the audience have questions specifically for Sebastian or Christina on their presentation, or we'd like to refer back to any of the other presentations that we've seen so far in this session. As I sort of warned everyone at the beginning, it was a very, very varied session, and that we're looking at this topic from a huge range of angles. But you can see there is definite connection between what we're all presenting here. There's clear demonstration of kind of how resilience is important to ensure that the ecosystem services of the ocean continue to be kind of available to humanity, and that's recognized in human rights, or the connection to human rights, where crucial services are supporting kind of societies and people world over, but also we've got these threats of kind of decreasing resilience, as shown by Sebastian and Christina, and resilience or biodiversity. I don't know, biodiversity, coral complexity, I suppose is the right summary. So I don't know if there are any questions that we have. Sebastian, do you have something you'd like to discuss?
Yes, thank you. I'd like to come back to some of the information that Aurelie was talking about earlier, and with the plankton. And we know for these deep sea coral reefs, that's food availability is going to be a big thing for them. But something which is a challenge for these deep sea corals as well is they are out of sight and out of mind. And while everybody knows about the tropical coral reefs, deep sea reefs, and especially deep sea reefs in areas beyond national jurisdiction, may not have that immediate selling point of how important they are. They are really important, but that's a challenge for us. And I think it's the same, which is true for the plankton story as well. So are you really trying to find those links to fisheries? Is that where you're looking first, Aurelie? Yeah,
so absolutely, and thank you very much. And I think that you're absolutely right. I mean, for plankton, I mean, I think they are not recognized at their value. I mean, for all the things they are providing. But I think, and I want to react as well to what Holly said, is that I think the ocean is very complex, and it's we are human beings are impacting both the physics of the ocean, changing the temperature, the parameters, etc., and also the biology. I mean, we're impacting severely life in the ocean. I mean, but we need a healthy ocean, functioning ocean, to be able to live on this planet. So I think this is really, we should talk more about plankton. We should talk more about cold water coral, definitely. And I've been working on Simons, so I know exactly what I mean, and they are extremely extremely important in areas beyond national jurisdiction because they are really hotspot of biodiversity there, and sustaining a lot of marine life, including bigger predators or bigger animals. That's for sure. And I think we absolutely need to promote the existence of all the complexity, but all sectors of marine life to policymakers, because we really need to understand what we are damaging right now. And several of us mentioned that we are damaging something that we don't even know. I mean, and that's very scary. And so, yeah, but definitely I think that's one of our role or responsibility is really to raise awareness about everything that is going on in the ocean right now. And it's far away, and BNGs are also far away. I mean, and it's also something that a lot of hope for the BBNG agreement, that and the importance of this treaty that is negotiated right now. I think that's yeah, as Valentina said.
I don't know if anyone else has a question they'd like to raise. If not, then I will jump in. And I was just wondering, and perhaps Alana, you touched on this. This is one for both Alana and Valentina, I suppose. And I was just wondering if, in your experience working in this area, whether there has been any sort of substantial, maybe that's the wrong word talking to lawyers here, but that has another meaning in and of itself, doesn't it? I take that back. Sort of connection between kind of human rights and the BBNJ as it's been developed.
I think that is the first important thing to note is that sorry, that human rights are actually emerging within the ocean sphere at the moment. And I think that in terms of the ABNJ and the BBNJ agreement, because it's a rapidly evolving agreement, it's something that we're gonna have to further tease out. As Valentina will no doubt pick up on, I would have mentioned this August, substantial, I suppose, use that word, given the draft we had before, because a lot of things were so much up in the air, and we've come a tremendous way, so we can begin to see areas which synchronize with existing rights that we have already identified in other areas of the ocean. But certainly this is an area that is, I don't want to say nascent, but maybe emerging, because human rights in the context of marine spaces not as developed as we'd like, and certainly not as well established as in terrestrial spaces.
And maybe, Oli, if I can jump in just to exactly reiterate the fact that human rights in the oceans is, yes, just now starting to be looked at. In the current draft of the text of an agreement, there is no reference to human rights. And as I was mentioning, it is in the hopes of many that the next session early next year will be the closing session before the text of the agreement is adopted. So of course, not for me to determine whether that issue will be brought up or not, but given that we are very, very close to the end of the negotiations, hopefully, I can maybe say that it looks a little bit difficult that it might come up at this late point. But of course, it's state-led, so up to them.
Holly, if I can add, yes, thank you. So no, I wanted to say that I think it's very crucial that the BBNG agreement is future-proof. I mean, and it will be able to adapt to the new condition under this climate change that we, are living, because it really needs to be able to, for example, marine protected areas in the high seas will need to be able to be modified to still continue what you want to preserve if for example, your species have moved, I mean, you will need to be able to adapt. I mean, and that's a key thing. And I think, yeah, I really like the human rights angle to it, and I think it should be around it, even if it's not in the draft treaty text, because I think it's very vital. It should underline everything that we are doing and negotiating into the BBNJ agreement.
Great. We're nearing the end of the event now, so I'll just open the floor for any more questions that are that our attendees might have for our panelists. You could just really quickly let us know, and while we're waiting for that, I'll just say thank you to everybody for joining us. As we were discussing before we started this event, it's a topic that many people seem to be working on: climate change and the environment and ecosystem services and the ocean, but actually talking about it together, and it's something that's seemingly quite difficult to conceptualize the link between climate governance and marine ecosystem services. Despite, you know, a broad acknowledgement that this topic is really important. So I'd like to thank our speakers for committing to tackle this difficult topic, even though perhaps we were coming at it from slightly disparate angles. It is just a demonstration of the fact that there are people working in this space. It's complex, and that we've got to find a way to sort of bring everything, all of our knowledge and all of the challenges that we're working together to hopefully influence change, so that the governance going forward in terms of climate and the ocean can respond to these kind of really important societal challenges. So with that, I direct you to all of the work of our lovely speakers. They all have lovely wonderful papers and links that you can follow, and thank you for attending. I'll call it to an end. Thank you.